Hey everyone, welcome to the Wordsmith's Forge. I am your humble wordsmith, Matthew J. Coran, author of the Breathsinger Saga, which is a Christian fantasy series, the first of which is now available on Amazon, and I'll put the link below to that. But today I wanted to talk about how you show truth in a story and how I got into fantasy. Because one thing that was very interesting as a getting into writing for the first time and talking to people who aren't writers, just like people you see every day. The first thing that always gets asked when they start seeing some of my work is, how did you come up with this? Like, especially with fantasy, some of these themes, it's interesting how some of them play out and how people perceive them. Like, for example, Gollum in Lord of the Rings. Like, you just think, how does anyone come up with that? And I'll get to that, and I'll explain it. Because a little bit of background for me, I'm a engineer by trade, but I also love writing. And so I have a kind of mentality where I can see the mechanisms of storytelling and how they work together to kind of form the final product, the final story. And so we'll get into first what fantasy is and what it isn't. Because when I was first getting into my book series and pitching it to a lot of people didn't seem to have interest in the fantasy genre specifically. And they would often respond with something along the lines of, I like things that are more real, like fantasies kind of just head in the clouds, not really relatable. And it's like a lot of times that's the response to fiction in general, but fantasy, it's a bit more it's a bit more of a general reaction to it because it's so obscure so often. But is fantasy real? Because first we need to define what real means. Because in a lot of ways, fantasy is real because we relate to a lot of the themes in fantasy. Or it will reveal a truth that even though it's in a form that you don't see every day, like Gollum, a little dwarf thing that's kind of demonic looking and obsesses over a magic ring, you don't see that every day, but there's a message there that you do resonate with, which is why it's so memorable to us. And so the reality in fantasy is the truth that's allegorically expressed, meaning it's often a symbol or something that points to truth. And so going back to the Gollum example, what is it about Gollum that's true that is so memorable to so many people? We don't see midgets walking around with rings, obviously. But what do we see that's very similar to that? We see people with idols. We see people who idolize certain people, certain objects, and they obsess over them. Whether it's money, whether it's alcohol, whether it's women, whether it's some material possession of some kind, people will dedicate their lives to acquiring that thing. Like how many pickup artists do you see on YouTube who obsess over getting as much approval from women as possible? Or how many people do you know who just spend a lot of their spare money on alcohol and partying? People, without even realizing, they have idols in their lives that they spend an inordinate amount of time focusing on. And so that's the character, that's the type that Gollum shows. Gollum goes crazy and literally loses his mind and just focusing on this one thing. And that's the inevitable consequence of people who practice idolatry. It slowly consumes their entire life, and they end up having to sacrifice everything else to get more and more of that one thing that fills this black hole in their lives. It's insatiable. It's a hunger that doesn't go away because it's a God-sized hole in people's hearts. And that's the thing that Tolkien illustrates. It's power. It's something that makes you feel powerful. That's why it's a God-sized hole, because God, who's the ultimate source of power, when that's missing from your life, you try to fill it with some other power, something that makes you feel powerful, something that makes you feel like God. And it makes you go crazy because you have to constantly be reminded that you're not God. You will be constantly reminded of that. And so stories like this in fantasy, that's what they are meant to reveal. Maybe not that specific point, but it's things that it's easier to show in the form of a character or a creature or some form of magic. You know, and we'll take my book, for example, the Breath Singer Saga. The magic of the book is breath. It's the magic of people who they breathe in, and then their aura flares up, their ruach, it's called. And from that aura, they can manifest different powers. And so, what is that really saying? If you go into Genesis 2:7, it talks about how God breathed life into man. There is a magic to breath. There's a real life magic to it. It's often associated with the soul in all different kinds of ancient writings, different religions. It's something that's universally understood, breath and your spirit to be intertwined. And so people have their own individual spirit, they have their own souls. And so people manifest different abilities. Their spirit is unique, and so they have different things to contribute to the world. And many people have very similar things to contribute, but it's always different in their own unique way. And so that's something I illustrate in my book, is that even though people have, there are people known as breath singers who have these abilities, and it's very exaggerated, because some people have very exaggerated abilities in real life that many people end up seeing, you know, like a lot of famous writers, a lot of famous athletes, their abilities are very exaggerated, but it's also uniquely them. And so with this story, you see the magic of people's breath manifest in ways that shape their actions in the world around them. And so it's something that's true without having to be literally true. You know, it's something that people can see and they can resonate with. It's like, oh yeah, magic that's unique to a person, that's associated with their spirit. Like, they might not think that in the words, but like on a subconscious level, they understand it. People remember things that resonate with them. They don't have to necessarily be conscious of it. We see this in so many stories throughout the years, like stories that are thousands of years old that people still talk about because there's something relatable to it. Greek myths even. And it's like, most people don't think that these things literally happened the way they're described, but they remember them anyway. So there's a certain aspect of storytelling that's real without having everything needing to be historically, literally true. And so if you're a writer or someone who's reading, you can learn to appreciate the use of symbol, the use of allegory, whether it's in a fantasy setting or even just in general fiction. You can learn to appreciate the truth that's being conveyed in very subtle ways, because a lot of times it's hard to convey truth in just a literal sense and just saying it. A lot of people don't like the truth. They don't want to admit it, but a lot of times the truth can be very offensive or it can be very hard to accept. But when you see it in the form of a story, it makes it easier to understand and easier to digest. Like putting, like that old saying, a little bit of sugar makes the medicine go down. And sometimes that allegory is a little bit of sugar. And so, yeah, as you go through the world of fiction and as you look at different writings, whether it's fantasy fiction or historical fiction or mythological fiction, or as you begin your writing journey yourself, if you're a writer like me, you can really start to see the necessity for symbols and allegory in your writings. And yeah, if you would like to see this work put into action, you can check out my book, Heir to Song and Sword. It's available now on Amazon, and I'll leave the link down below. Take care and God bless.